This is the 8th video of the market failure series. This video will cover the high-level only component of the market failure unit. In this video, I will discuss and explain two problems of market failure: the problem of asymmetric information and the problem of abuse of monopoly power. So let's start with the first problem, the problem of asymmetric information, or sometimes it is called imperfect information. So the problem of imperfect information can be understood by looking at what a perfect market would be like. In a perfect market, consumers and producers should have perfect knowledge of the market. Knowledge about all prices, costs, competitors, ingredients, if we're talking about anything food related, components, etc. Now this is very theoretical and very unrealistic. Remember, anything that's perfect is not very realistic. It's very idealistic. In reality, consumers and producers sometimes make economic decisions based on incomplete or imperfect information. This makes it hard for the marginal revenue to equal marginal cost and therefore results in a type of market failure. So it makes it difficult for marginal social benefits to equal marginal social costs. Marginal social benefits do not equal marginal social costs, and therefore it is a type of market failure. Let's define asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is a situation when one party in an economic transaction, it could be either the buyer or the seller, possesses more information than the other party. And this is the problem of asymmetric information. So there are situations where the producer or the seller has more information than the consumer or the buyer. This can result in the producer or the seller charging a higher price than the socially efficient price and leads to an over-allocation of resources. For example, producers not labeling packaged food with the nutritional information. So consumers end up consuming ingredients that are very harmful to them and they did not know. Or a seller of a used car not being entirely honest about how well functioning the car is. The market for used cars is full of many situations where this happens. Or a seller of a house not being entirely honest about the maintenance history of the house. So these are all situations where the producer or the seller has more information than the consumer or the buyer. And therefore the buyer is not well informed and can make an ill-informed decision. There are also situations where the consumer or the buyer has more information than the seller or the producer. So the consumer in that situation ends up paying a price that is lower than the socially efficient price, and this leads to an under-allocation of resources. For example, a health insurance buyer not being entirely honest about their eating habits or their lifestyle habits, like smoking and doing drugs, and so they end up paying a lower insurance premium than what they should be charged. While this might be good for the buyer or the consumer, it's not necessarily good for the insurance company. Or maybe an applicant for a bank loan, if I'm going to apply for a bank loan and I'm not being honest about my credit worthiness or my credit history, and so I end up being charged a lower interest rate than what I should be charged. These are all examples of asymmetric information where the customer or the buyer has more information than the seller. So there are some ways governments can intervene in the market to try to correct this type of market failure. They may use legislation and regulation to improve the flow of information and prevent the more informed party in an economic transaction from taking advantage of the less informed party. However, this intervention is often expensive and does not work for all markets. What about consumers' or producers' right to privacy? Where do we draw the line? People are entitled to privacy and keeping certain bits of information to themselves. For example, how much information about my lifestyle and habits does my health insurance company need to know in order to charge me the insurance premium that's best suited for my lifestyle and my habits? On the plus side, though, technology has improved access to information and has allowed consumers and producers access to much better information. So that's an upside to technological advancement and access to the internet, for example. The other type of market failure that is prescribed for the high level only students is that of imperfect competition. Now, this will be clearer when we move on to the market structures and theory of the firm unit. Imperfect competition is another word for abuse of monopoly power. So let's briefly discuss this, and then remember it will be covered in more detail in another video under the theory of the firm and the market structures unit. So, monopolists, oligopolists, and other imperfectly competitive firms, what they do is they often restrict output to allow them to charge higher prices and thus earn higher profits. This results in them they do not produce the socially optimum level of output where marginal social cost equal marginal social benefit, which therefore results in a loss of community surplus or result in a welfare loss. This is another type of market failure. There are many ways governments can intervene to correct this market failure. They may try to reduce this market failure by intervening in the markets to reduce monopoly power. They can use legislation to make markets more competitive or to make maybe mergers and takeovers more difficult. So no two companies, for example, come together and merge and become one really super powerful, super big monopolist. They can set up regulatory bodies, so using regulation to oversee markets and take action if they feel like a monopolist is exploiting consumers or working against the public interest. They can just step in and nationalize or take over the monopoly themselves and transfer ownership of that company to the public sector. That's another way. Or they can take trade liberalization measures to open up the economy to global competition, and hence, when faced with global competition, this will encourage monopolists to be more efficient and more competitive. Now remember, these types of government intervention to correct the market failure each have their own advantages and disadvantages. So remember, when asked to evaluate, you might be able to look at the pros and cons of each policy or each government intervention measure.